The screen is black. There is no horizon. There is no sky. There is only the deep, rhythmic pulse of a sonar ping, a sound that is both mechanical and strangely biological, like a metal heart beating. In a fluid void, we are looking at the ocean, but not the ocean of sunlight and waves. This is the ocean of the mid-20th century, a domain that has ceased to be a geography and has become a weapon. Above, the ice of the Arctic forms a solid, crushing ceiling. Below, the abyss drops away into eternal darkness. Between these two layers of death moves a shape. It is silent, it is invisible, and it carries the power to end civilization. This is the story of the K-3 Leninsky Komsomol, the first nuclear submarine of the Soviet Union. But to tell the story of a ship, we must first understand the terror that built it. This is not a story about rivets, steel plates, or reactor diagrams. It is a story about a specific moment in human history when the world realized that the most dangerous weapons were the ones one could see. The Cold War was defined by visibility. We could see the tanks massing on the borders of Germany. We could see the strategic bombers glistening on the tarmacs of North Dakota and Siberia. We could see the mushroom clouds rising over the test sites in the Pacific and Kazakhstan. But the ocean hid the truth. In the years following World War II, the balance of terror was precarious. The atomic bomb had changed the fundamental logic of warfare. Victory was no longer about capturing territory. It was about the ability to strike second. If you could survive the first attack and retaliate, you won the future, or at least you ensured the enemies had no future either. For the first decade of the atomic age, this deterrence was based on airplanes. Bombers needed runways. Runways were fixed targets. If you could destroy the runways in a surprise attack, you could win. The system was unstable. It relied on early warning, on pilots sitting in cockpits 24 hours a day, waiting for a signal. Then the ocean changed everything. Naval strategists realized that if you could put a nuclear weapon on a ship, it became harder to find. If you could put it on a submarine, it became impossible to find. But there was a problem. World War II submarines were not true submarines. They were surface ships that could dip underwater for brief periods. They ran on diesel engines that needed air. To charge their batteries, they had to surface or snorkel, exposing themselves to radar and aircraft. They were tethered to the atmosphere. They were prisoners of oxygen. A diesel submarine could hide for a day, maybe two, but eventually it had to come up for air, and in the nuclear age, surfacing was death. In 1954, the United States Navy severed that tether. The launch of the USS Nautilus was a moment of profound psychological shock for the Soviet Union, comparable only to the launch of Sputnik for the Americans 3 years later. The Nautilus was not just a new ship, it was a new species. Powered by a nuclear reactor, it did not need air to generate energy. It split uranium atoms to boil water, turning turbines that could drive the propeller forever. It made its own oxygen. It distilled its own water. It was an independent ecosystem, a sealed planet that could drift through the cosmos of the ocean for months without ever seeing the sun. When the Nautilus signaled underway on nuclear power, it changed the geometry of the world. Suddenly, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were no longer barriers protecting the Soviet Union. They were highways. An American nuclear submarine could dive off the coast of New York, travel beneath the polar ice cap, invisible to radar, immune to storms, and surface in the Barents Sea on the doorstep of Murmansk. The Arctic, which had protected Russia for 1,000 years with its impenetrable ice, was no longer a shield. It was a corridor. For the Kremlin, this was not a tactical problem. It was an existential nightmare. The Soviet leadership, still traumatized by the surprise invasion of 1941, looked at the map and saw a new encirclement. They saw American submarines lurking under the ice, waiting for the order to fire. They saw a weapon they could not track, could not catch, and could not kill. The Nautilus was not faster because of its hull shape. It was faster because it never had to stop. It was not bigger because of its guns. It was bigger because it carried the weight of a new industrial revolution inside it. This is the context in which Project 620 Senun, the K-3, was born. It was not born of scientific curiosity, it was born of panic. It is 1955. Inside the high-ceilinged offices of the Kremlin, the mood is one of controlled hysteria. The reports from naval intelligence are grim. The Americans have the Nautilus. They are building more. They are developing missiles that can be launched from underwater. The Soviet Union has nothing comparable. The Soviet Navy is massive, but it is largely a coastal defense force. It has hundreds of diesel submarines, but against a nuclear boat, a diesel sub is like a biplane fighting a jet. The diesel sub has to wait, the nuclear sub can hunt. Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet military leadership realize something terrifying. They may already be obsolete. In the logic of the Cold War, a gap in capability is an invitation to attack. If the Americans believe they have total superiority under the sea, they might be tempted to use it. They might believe they can win a nuclear war. Therefore, the Soviet Union must build a nuclear submarine. Not in 10 years, not in 5 years, now. This urgency creates a specific kind of pressure. Time becomes the enemy. Every day that passes without a Soviet nuclear submarine is a day the USSR is vulnerable. But building a nuclear submarine is not like building a tank. It requires technologies that the Soviet Union does not yet possess. It requires metallurgy capable of withstanding extreme pressures and radiation. It requires precision instrumentation. It requires a nuclear reactor small enough to fit inside a hull, yet stable enough not to kill the crew. The scientists are summoned. The academician, Anatoly Alexandrov, a giant of Soviet physics, is put in charge of the reactor. Vladimir Peregudov, a brilliant naval architect, is put in charge of the ship. They are given a blank check. They are given absolute priority. But they are also given a deadline that is physically impossible. Catch up and overtake. This is the slogan. But in engineering, you cannot simply sprint. You have to test. You have to fail. You have to iterate. The Soviet leadership, however, does not accept the necessity of failure. They demand a weapon. They demand parity. This decision sets the trajectory for the entire life of the K-3. It will not be a machine built with the careful, methodical safety margins of the American program. The Americans, under Admiral Rickover, spent years testing components on land before putting them to sea. They prioritized stability. The Soviets prioritized speed. They decided to skip the prototype stage. They would build the first ship and the production line simultaneously. They would learn how to build it while they were building it. It was a gamble of staggering proportions. If they failed, they would waste billions of rubles and leave the country defenseless. If they succeeded, they would close the gap. But there is a third possibility, one that no one in the meetings dares to voice loud enough to stop the project. They might succeed in building the machine, but in their haste, they might build a monster. A ship that is fast, powerful, and utterly unforgiving. A ship that treats its crew not as operators, but as biological components in a dangerous experiment. The order is signed. Project 627 is a go. The secrecy is absolute. The workers in the shipyards of Severodvinsk are told nothing about what they are building. The engineers work in closed cities, cut off from the world. The K-3 is not designed because the technology is ready. It is designed because it is necessary. And in the Soviet Union, necessity has a way of bending the laws of physics, or at least ignoring the safety warnings attached to them. The stage is set, the race is on, and the men who will eventually step inside the steel hull of the K-3 have no idea that their fate is being decided in a room in Moscow by men who are looking at a map and seeing only fear. The birth of the K-3 begins in a world of fragmented secrets. In the mid-1950s, the Soviet Union is a fortress of compartmentalized information. The men tasked with building the country's first nuclear submarine are working in a fog of state-imposed silence. The designers in Leningrad know the shape of the hull, but they aren't allowed to know the specifics of the reactor. The physicists in Moscow know the neutron flux of the core, but they have never seen the ocean. This fragmentation is deliberate. Secrecy is the state's primary defense. If no one knows the whole picture, no spy can steal it. But for the engineers trying to build the most complex machine in human history, this secrecy is a nightmare. They are trying to assemble a puzzle in the dark, and the pieces are being handed to them one by men with guns. Project 627, the official designation for the K-3, is unlike anything Soviet industry has ever attempted. Previous submarines were evolutionary. They took a hull from 1945, added a snorkel from 1948, and a better battery from 1950. They were iterative improvements on a known theme. The K-3 is a jump into the void. The chief designer, Vladimir Peregudov, faces a challenge that borders on the absurd. He has to design a submarine for a power source that doesn't exist yet. He has to design a hull shape for speeds that no submarine has ever reached. And he has to do it without the aid of computer modeling. In the 1950s, computing meant a room full of mathematicians, mostly women, working with slide rules and log tables. They calculate the hydrodynamics by hand. They estimate the stress on the steel plates with pencil and paper. Every curve of the hull, every pipe bend, every valve is drawn on drafting tables under the hum of fluorescent lights. The lack of operational precedent is terrifying. When the Americans built the Nautilus, they had the luxury of a robust industrial base and a culture of testing. The Soviets have neither. They are inventing the metallurgy as they go. They are creating new alloys to withstand the heat and radiation. They are building the factories to build the tools to build the ship. It is engineering without a map. Normally, a project of this magnitude would begin with a prototype. You would build a reactor on land, you would run it for a year, you would break it, you would fix it. Then, and only then, would you put it in a ship. But the timeline from the Kremlin does not allow for a year of testing. The order is to build the land-based prototype and the actual submarine simultaneously. This decision is the original sin of the K-3 program. It means that if a flaw is discovered in the prototype, the submarine is already half built, with that same flaw embedded in its steel bones. The pressure on the designers is immense. They are patriots, yes, but they are also survivors of the Stalinist era. They know the cost of failure. In the Soviet system, a delayed project is not just a management issue, it is a political crime. Sabotage is a word that hangs in the air like smoke, so they work faster. They cut corners on things that seem secondary, crew comfort, radiation shielding, ease of maintenance, to focus on the things that the leadership demands, speed and power. The result is a design that is visually striking. The K-3 does not look like the blocky, utilitarian diesel boats of the war. It has a rounded, whale-like nose. Its sail is streamlined. It looks fast even when it is sitting on the drafting table. It is a predator designed for a new age. But the soul of the machine is not the hull, it is the reactor. The heart of the K-3 is a pair of pressurized water reactors designated VMI. This is where the divergence between American and Soviet philosophy becomes most stark and most dangerous. The American philosophy, driven by Hyman Rickover, was conservatism. The reactor on the Nautilus was designed to be stable. It was large, heavy, and operated with massive safety margins. If something went wrong, the physics of the reactor naturally tended to shut it down. The Soviet philosophy, driven by the frantic need to catch up, was performance. The Soviet reactor had to be smaller. It had to fit into a narrower hull. It had to produce more power per kilogram of weight. To achieve this, the designers pushed the physics to the edge. They increased the power density of the core. They reduced the shielding. They shaved weight off the cooling pumps. The result was a miracle of engineering. A reactor that was compact, incredibly powerful, and capable of driving the submarine at speeds that would shock the world. But it was a nervous miracle. The VMI reactor had minimal safety margins. It was prone to iodine pits, complex fluctuations in neutron absorption that could make the reactor unpredictable during startup and shutdown. The control rods, the brakes of the nuclear reaction, were finicky. The steam generators, which transferred the heat from the radioactive primary loop to the non-radioactive secondary loop, were a maze of microscopic welds that were prone to cracking. The designers knew they were taking risks, but they rationalized them. This was a warship, after all. Risk was part of the mission. A tank doesn't have air conditioning. Why should a submarine have perfect safety? The priority was to get the weapon to the fight. This mentality seeped into the construction of the ship itself. In the shipyard at Severodvinsk on the edge of the White Sea, the K-3 began to take shape. It was built in a massive covered shed to hide it from American spy planes. The workers toiled in shifts, 24 hours a day, through the brutal Arctic winter. The atmosphere in the shipyard was frantic. Welders were encouraged to work faster. Inspectors were pressured to sign off on components that were good enough. The spirit of the Stakhanovite movement, overfulfilling the quota, clashed violently with the unforgiving precision required for nuclear technology. You can rush a tank track. You cannot rush a reactor coolant pipe. A microscopic crack in a coolant pipe is not a maintenance issue. It is a catastrophe waiting to happen. But the schedule was God. By 1957, the ship is ready for launch. It is a beautiful, deadly object. 107 meters long, displacing 3,000 tons. Painted a dark, menacing gray. When the bottle of champagne is smashed against the bow, the crowd cheers, the band plays. The speeches praise the Communist Party and the genius of Soviet science. But the engineers standing in the back row are not cheering. They are holding their breath. They know what lies inside the hull. They know the compromises that were made. They know that they have built a machine that is powerful, yes, but also fragile. As the K-3 slides into the water, it carries more than just torpedoes. It carries the ambition of a superpower that refuses to be second. And it carries a nuclear heart that beats a little too fast, a little too hot, and with a temper that its creators do not fully understand. The crew that will man this vessel is the elite of the Soviet Navy. They are young, intelligent, and fiercely loyal. They have been selected for their political reliability as much as their technical skill. They are told that they are pioneers. They are told that they are the equals of the cosmonauts. But they are not told everything. They are not told about the cracks in the steam generators. They are not told about the thinness of the biological shield. They are not told that the sensors designed to detect radiation leaks are calibrated to scales that might be too optimistic for reality. They board the ship with pride. They enter the steel belly of the beast. They learn to operate the valves and the switches. They learn the rhythm of the reactor. But there is an invisible crew member on board the K-3. It is there from the moment the reactor goes critical. It has no rank. It has no face. It is radiation. In the early days of the nuclear age, radiation was misunderstood. It was feared, yes, but it was also treated as an abstraction. The doctors knew it caused sickness, but the sailors didn't have the visceral dread of it that we have today. They couldn't see it. They couldn't smell it. On the K-3, the radiation environment is messy. The primary loop leaks. Not a lot, just a little. A wisp of radioactive steam here. A drip of coolant there. In an American submarine, this would be cause for an immediate shutdown and evacuation. On the K-3, it is treated as a nuisance. The air scrubbers are turned up. The crew is told not to worry. It's just the smell of the atom, they joke. But the sailors start to feel it. Headaches, a metallic taste in the mouth, a strange fatigue that sleep doesn't cure. They go to the ship's doctor, but the doctor has orders too. He records the symptoms but doesn't connect the dots. Or if he does, he keeps the picture to himself. This is the ethical tension at the heart of the K-3 story. How much truth can a state afford to tell its soldiers? If the sailors knew the reactor was leaking, would they sail? If they knew the shielding was inadequate, would they sleep in their bunks, just meters away from the core? The state decides that the mission is more important than the truth. The K-3 must sail. It must prove to the Americans that the monopoly is broken. And so the K-3 heads out to sea. It is a triumph of will over matter. It is faster than the Nautilus. It can dive deeper. On paper, it is superior. But the Nautilus is a comfortable, reliable Cadillac. The K-3 is a stripped-down drag racer with a leaking fuel line. It is built for a sprint, not a marathon. It is built for war, not for longevity. The clash of systems is not just about specs, it is about philosophy. The Americans built a machine to survive the ocean. The Soviets built a machine to conquer it, regardless of the cost. As the K-3 leaves the harbor, disappearing into the gray swells of the Barents Sea, it is entering a new world, a world where the old rules of seamanship don't apply, a world where the danger doesn't come from the waves, but from the very engine that drives the ship. The ocean is waiting, the ice is waiting, and the reactor is humming its silent, deadly tune. The pioneers of the atomic age are underway, and there is no turning back. The invisible crew member aboard the K-3 Leninsky Komsomol does not appear on the roster. It does not eat in the galley, and it does not sleep in a bunk. But it is always there, drifting through the compartments, settling in the dust, and weaving itself into the uniforms of the men. Its name is radiation. In the late 1950s, the understanding of long-term radiation exposure among the rank-and-file Soviet sailors was limited. They knew about the bomb. They knew about acute radiation sickness, the vomiting, the hair loss, the bleeding that came from massive exposure. But they were less educated about the slow, insidious accumulation of REM and Sievert. They did not fully grasp that invisible particles could rewrite their DNA while they slept. The atmosphere inside the K-3 is distinct. Veteran submariners describe a specific smell associated with early nuclear boats. A mix of ozone, hot metal, and something sharper, metallic, almost like the taste of blood on the tongue. This was the breath of the reactor. The VMA reactors, built with such haste and compacted into such tight spaces, were prone to microscopic leaks. The steam generators, a nightmare of thousands of tiny welds, often wept radioactive fluid into the secondary loop. On an American submarine like the Nautilus, a radiation leak triggered alarms, lockdowns, and immediate surfacing. The philosophy was al-lahra, as low as reasonably achievable. The crew's health was a strategic asset. On the K-3, the philosophy was different. The alarms did go off. But when the alarms ring constantly, they stop being warnings and start being background noise. The officers would sometimes recalibrate the sensors to higher thresholds just to stop the ringing so the crew could sleep. It's just instrumentation error, they would say. The sensors are too sensitive. This denial was a survival mechanism. If they acknowledged every leak, the ship would never sail, and the ship had to sail. So the crew lived in a state of cognitive dissonance. They knew the reactor was dirty, but they trusted the state. They trusted that the thick steel bulkheads and the lead shielding would protect them. But the shielding on the K-3 was thinner than on Western ships. To save weight and increase speed, the designers had shaved centimeters off the biological shield, the barrier between the reactor compartment and the rest of the ship. In the control room or the turbine hall, the levels were generally safe, but in the reactor compartment itself, or in the corridors adjacent to it, the shine was real. The sailors began to notice changes, small things, a persistent fatigue that coffee couldn't fix, headaches that throbbed behind the eyes, a metallic taste that ruined the flavor of the food. They went to the ship's doctor, a young man named Arseny Solovay. He listened, he measured, but he was trapped in the same system. He had orders to keep the crew operational. He dispensed aspirin and vitamins. He didn't write radiation poisoning in the logs. He wrote vegetative vascular dystonia, or fatigue due to watch standing. The state was performing a calculated trade, the health of 100 young men in exchange for strategic parity. It is a brutal calculus, but in the logic of the Cold War, it made sense. Soldiers die in war. This was a war, just a cold one. These men were the frontline troops, and their bodies were the armor of the state. But the K-3 was not just a radiation trap. It was also a technological marvel that, in purely kinetic terms, outclassed its American rival. When we compare the K-3 to the USS Nautilus, we are looking at a clash of civilizations expressed in steel. The Nautilus was a bulky, somewhat clumsy vessel. It had a conventional hull shape, borrowed from diesel submarines, which meant it pushed a lot of water. It was noisy, it vibrated. Its top speed was roughly 23 knots. The K-3 was a shark. Its hull was streamlined, a teardrop shape optimized for underwater flight. Its 2 reactors produced nearly twice the power of the Nautilus. It could hit 30 knots submerged. In a dogfight, the K-3 could run circles around the American boat. It could dictate the terms of the engagement. The Americans built a submarine to endure. The Nautilus was designed with redundant safety systems, roomy crew quarters, and easy access for maintenance. It was built like a Cadillac, heavy, comfortable, and reliable. The Soviets built a submarine to attack. The K-3 was cramped. The crew slept in hot bunk shifts. Maintenance was a nightmare because the machinery was packed so tightly that to fix a pump, you often had to cut through a bulkhead. It was built like a MiG fighter jet, fast, lethal, and fragile. This difference reflects the industrial reality of the two nations. The United States had an economy of abundance. They could afford to build big, heavy, safe ships. They had the luxury of inefficiency. The Soviet Union operated in an economy of mobilized scarcity. They had to do more with less. They had to squeeze every ounce of performance out of every kilogram of metal. This necessity drove innovation, but it also drove danger. The K-3 was faster, yes, but it aged faster too. The stress of running high-performance reactors at the limit took a toll on the metal. The pipes grew brittle. The seals degraded. The K-3 was a sprinter, burning itself out in a race against time while the American fleet was training for a marathon. But in 1958 and 1959, the sprint was winning. The K-3 was breaking records. It was proving that the Soviet Union could not only match the West, but exceed it. The pride of the crew was genuine. They knew they were riding a dragon. They knew their ship was the fastest thing in the ocean. When they hit 30 knots, the hull hummed, the deck vibrated, and the sensation of speed was intoxicating. They felt invincible. It is easy to judge the Soviet designers for their recklessness. But we must remember the context. They truly believed that the Americans were preparing to attack. They believed that without the K-3, their cities would burn. In that light, the radiation leaks seemed like a small price to pay. What is a little sickness compared to the annihilation of your homeland? This is the psychological landscape of the K-3. It is a ship driven by patriotism and paranoia. The crew loves their ship even as it kills them. They protect its secrets even as those secrets endanger them. And now, the ship is ready for its greatest test, the Arctic. The Americans had already sent the Nautilus under the North Pole in 1958. It was a massive propaganda victory. "The pole is ours," the headlines screamed. It proved that American submarines could use the ice cap as a transit route to the Soviet coast. The Kremlin demanded an answer. The K-3 was ordered to go north. This mission would be different from the sea trials in the Barents Sea. The Arctic Ocean is a hostile, alien environment. Above the water, it is a frozen desert. Below the water, it is a maze of ice keels, massive, jagged mountains of ice that hang down from the surface, sometimes reaching depths of 30 or 40 meters. To navigate under the ice is to fly blind through a canyon where the ceiling is constantly changing. Standard magnetic compasses don't work near the pole. Gyroscopes drift. The sonar becomes confused by the infinite reflections of the ice. And if something goes wrong, if a fire breaks out or the reactor scrams, there is no surfacing. You cannot blow the ballast tanks and pop up to safety. Above you is 3 meters of solid ice. You are sealed in a tomb. The crew of the K-3 prepares for this journey with a mix of excitement and dread. They load extra food. They write letters home that they cannot mail. They check the radiation sensors one last time, tapping the dials, hoping the needles stay in the green. The captain, Lev Jiltso, is a man of immense calm. He knows the risks, he knows his ship is imperfect, but he also knows that his orders come directly from Nikita Khrushchev. There is no turning back. As the K-3 slips out of the base at Zapadnya Litsa and turns north, the water temperature drops. The color of the sea changes from gray to black. The floating ice begins to appear on the sonar screens, first as scattered blocks, then as a solid, continuous roof. The submarine dives deep. The world of air and light disappears. They are now entering a domain where no Soviet ship has ever gone. They are the first. But being first means there are no charts. Being first means there is no rescue. Being first means that if you die alone and your grave will never be marked. The ocean has become a weapon, yes, but now the K-3 is turning itself into a weapon to fight back. The duel is no longer just with the Americans, it is with the ice itself. To enter the Arctic Ocean in a submarine is to leave the known world behind. As the K-3 moves north from the Barents Sea, the environment changes fundamentally. The waves, which had rocked the hull even at depth, disappear. The ocean becomes unnervingly still. This stillness is not peace. It is the weight of the ice cap pressing down on the water, stifling the energy of the wind and the tides. For the crew, the transition is psychological as much as it is physical. In open water, there is always the emergency blow. If a fire starts, if a pipe bursts, if the reactor fails, the captain can pull the emergency handles. Compressed air blasts the water out of the ballast tanks and the submarine rockets to the surface. Within seconds, the hatch can be thrown open and fresh air rushes in. Survival is always just a few hundred feet straight up. Under the ice, that option vanishes. The ceiling of the world is solid. The ice pack varies in thickness from a few feet to massive ridges that can be 20 or 30 meters deep. If the K-3 suffers a catastrophe, it cannot surface. It would smash into the ice like a bug hitting a windshield. The crew is trapped in a horizontal dimension. To escape, they must travel hundreds of miles south or find a rare polinia, a crack in the ice large enough for the submarine to surface. But finding a polinia is like finding a specific pothole on a highway while driving blindfolded. The K-3 has rudimentary upward-looking sonar, devices designed to ping the ice and measure its thickness. But in 1962, this technology is primitive. The screens are grainy, the data is ambiguous. Is that a patch of thin ice, or is it a ghost echo? Is that a polinia, or is it just a slightly thinner block of granite hard ice? The navigation is equally terrifying. As they approach the North Pole, the standard rules of direction collapse. Magnetic compasses spin uselessly as the magnetic lines of force converge. Gyroscopes, the sophisticated spinning tops that keep the ship oriented, begin to drift. The navigators are forced to rely on complex mathematical calculations, dead reckoning, and intuition. A mistake of 1 degree over 1,000 miles means missing the target, or running into an underwater mountain. There are no charts for this. The ocean floor of the Arctic basin is largely unmapped. The K-3 is flying through a canyon where the floor and the ceiling are both unknown. Inside the steel coffin, the sensory experience shifts. The acoustics of the ice-covered ocean are strange. The ice reflects sound perfectly. The noise of the submarine, the whine of the turbines, the thrum of the pumps, bounces off the ceiling and comes back. It creates a claustrophobic echo chamber. The sonar operators struggle to filter out the noise of their own ship to hear what lies ahead. And then there is the sound of the ice itself. The ice cap is not silent. It is a living, grinding tectonic plate. The ice floes crash into each other. They crack, they groan. These sounds transmit through the water with terrifying clarity. To a sailor lying in his bunk, trying to sleep, it sounds like the hull is being crushed. A loud crack echoes through the steel, sounding like a gunshot. Men jump. Hearts race. Is it the hull failing? No, just the ice moving miles above. The pressure on the crew is immense. Every man knows that there is no rescue. If they sink, no one will find them. If they burn, they will die in the smoke. There is no radio communication with Moscow. The ice blocks radio waves. The K-3 is the loneliest object on the planet. But they push on. The mission is political. It is symbolic. The Americans have claimed the pole. The Soviet Union must reclaim it. As they near the North Pole, the tension in the control room is palpable. Captain Lev Jiltsov and his navigator stare at the plots. The math says they are there. But in a submarine, you cannot see the destination. You cannot see the flag planted by Peary or the path of the Nautilus. You have to trust the numbers. On July 17, 1962, the calculations align. The K-3 passes under the geographic North Pole. There is a moment of jubilation, but it is muted. Passing under the pole is a navigational triumph, but the mission requires something more visible. Khrushchev doesn't just want a logbook entry. He wants a photo. He wants the Soviet naval ensign flying in the Arctic wind. He wants the K-3 to surface. This is the most dangerous part of the mission. The captain has to find a hole in the ice. They circle, they listen. The upward-looking sonar pings the ceiling. Thick ice, thick ice, thick ice. Then a gap. The trace on the screen shows a patch of thin ice, perhaps only a few feet thick, or maybe open water. Jiltsov gives the order to ascend. Slowly, the submarine rises. They use a technique called vertical hovering, using the ballast tanks to control buoyancy with delicate precision. They drift up inch by inch. They extend the periscope. Jiltsov looks. He sees light, diffuse, milky light. It is the ice, but it is thin. Or is it? He decides to risk it. If the ice is too thick, he could damage the sail, the periscope, or the antennas. If he damages the sail, he might not be able to dive again, or he might crush the hatch, sealing them in forever. The K-3 pushes up. The sail strikes the ice. Crunch. The sound reverberates through the ship. The steel grinds against the frozen crust. The boat shudders. Then, with a sudden lurch, they break through. The periscope clears the slush. Jiltsov sees the white expanse of the Arctic, the gray sky, the jagged ridges of pressure ice. They have surfaced. The order is given to blow the tanks. The K-3 rises fully, smashing through the remaining ice like a monster emerging from hibernation. The hatches are thrown open. The crew spills out onto the deck. The air is freezing, pristine, and sweet. It is the first fresh air they have breathed in weeks. They scramble down the side of the sail onto the ice. It is a surreal scene, a black, nuclear-powered Leviathan sitting in a field of white. Sailors in heavy coats running around like children, throwing snowballs. They plant the Soviet flag in the ice. They take photos. The ship's photographer snaps the iconic image. The crew standing on the ice at the top of the world, the massive fin of the K-3, looming behind them. For a moment, the Cold War feels far away. There is only the triumph of exploration. They have done what seemed impossible. They have proven that Soviet technology can conquer the harshest environment on Earth. But beneath the celebration, the danger remains. The reactor is still running. The hull is cooling rapidly in the -30-degree air. The ice is shifting. If the pack closes in, it could crush the rudder or the propellers. They cannot stay long. This is the irony of the North Pole moment. It is a triumph on the surface, a propaganda victory that will be splashed across the pages of Pravda. The sailors will be named heroes of the Soviet Union. They will meet Khrushchev. They will be given medals and apartments. But the unresolved danger lies below. The K-3 is still a fragile, experimental machine. The journey back is just as dangerous as the journey out. The reactor is aging with every hour of operation. The steam generators are vibrating. The invisible cracks are growing. The success of the North Pole mission creates a dangerous illusion. It validates the reckless engineering. It tells the politicians that their gamble paid off. See, they say, we didn't need years of testing, we just needed Soviet courage. This validation is fatal. It ensures that the flaws of the K-3 will not be fixed but ignored. If the ship can go to the pole, surely it is fine. The warnings of the engineers are drowned out by the applause of the party. The K-3 dives again, leaving the flag behind to be buried by the snow. It slips back into the dark water, heading home. It returns as a hero ship. It becomes the Leninsky Komsomol, named after the Communist Youth League. It is the pride of the fleet. But a machine does not care about medals. Physics does not care about prestige. The wear and tear on the K-3 is accumulating. The radiation leaks are continuing. The gaskets are drying out. The ship is a ticking clock. For the next few years, the K-3 will serve as the vanguard of the Soviet Navy. It will patrol the Atlantic. It will chase American carriers. It will be pushed harder and harder because it is the only one of its kind that has proven itself. But it is a worn-out pioneer. The technology that was cutting edge in 1958 is becoming obsolete by 1965. Newer, better submarines are being built, but the K-3 is kept on the line. It is a symbol, and symbols are not allowed to retire. The crew changes. The heroes of the North Pole move on to other commands or retire. New sailors arrive, younger, less experienced men who look at the famous K-3 with awe. They do not know the history of the leaks. They do not know how close the ship came to failure on previous missions. They only know the legend. And so the stage is set for the tragedy. The K-3 has survived the ice. It has survived the Americans. But it cannot survive its own internal decay. The fire that will almost change history is already waiting in the hydraulic lines, in the tired wiring, in the complacency of a system that believes its own propaganda. The journey with no exit was not the trip to the pole. It is the operational life of the submarine itself. Once the K-3 entered the service of the state, there was no way out but destruction. By 1967, the K-3 Leninsky Komsomol is no longer the shiny, futuristic predator that conquered the North Pole. It is a tired ship. It has been ridden hard by the Soviet Navy for nearly a decade. The hull is scarred from the ice, the machinery is worn, the reactor shielding is degrading. In any rational navy, the K-3 would be in a dry dock for a comprehensive overhaul, or perhaps retired to a training role. But the Cold War does not allow for rest. The geopolitical situation in 1967 is a powder keg. The Six-Day War in the Middle East has just reshaped the map. Tensions between NATO and the Warsaw Pact are at a fever pitch. The Soviet Mediterranean Squadron is facing off against the U.S. Sixth Fleet. Every available hull is needed on the line to maintain the balance of terror. And so the K-3 is sent out again. It is September 8, 1967. The submarine is on patrol in the Norwegian Sea, transiting back from the Mediterranean. It is a long, exhausting deployment. The crew is tired. They are looking forward to home. They are roughly 1,500 miles from their base, cruising submerged in the deep, cold waters north of the Faroe Islands. Inside the boat, the atmosphere is routine. The watchstanders are drinking tea, the off-duty men are sleeping or playing dominoes. The reactor is humming steadily. But inside the hydraulic system of the first and second compartments, a microscopic failure is occurring. A gasket, perhaps original to the ship, perhaps a replacement of inferior quality, is giving way. The K-3 uses a high-pressure hydraulic system to operate its torpedo tubes, hydroplanes, and periscopes. The fluid is essentially oil under immense pressure. The gasket fails in the first compartment, the torpedo room. At 1:52, a fine mist of hydraulic fluid begins to spray into the air. It atomizes instantly. In the enclosed space of the submarine, where the air is recycled and dry, this mist is not just a mess. It is a fuel-air bomb. All it needs is a spark. A sailor flips a switch, perhaps a light, perhaps a pump. A tiny arc of electricity jumps between contacts. Whoosh! The air in the first compartment ignites. It is not a slow burn, it is a flash fire. A wall of flame erupts, consuming the oxygen and raising the temperature to over 1,000 degrees in seconds. The pressure wave hits the bulkheads like a hammer. The men in the first compartment, the torpedo men, don't have time to scream. They are engulfed. The fire burns the paint off the walls. It melts the insulation on the cables. But the horror is just beginning. The K-3 carries torpedoes. Some have conventional high-explosive warheads, Others carry nuclear warheads. They are sitting in the racks, right in the heart of the inferno. If the fire cooks off a warhead, it won't just destroy the submarine. It will create a nuclear explosion in the middle of the Norwegian Sea. In 1967, an underwater nuclear detonation could easily be misinterpreted. Is it an attack? Is it an American depth charge? In the tense, paranoid logic of the Cold War, this accident has the potential to start World War III. The alarm screams through the ship. Fire in the first compartment! Fire! In the second compartment, the living quarters and battery deck, the watch officer realizes the danger. The fire is spreading. The smoke, thick and toxic with burning plastic and hydraulic fluid, is pouring through the ventilation ducts. Standard procedure dictates that in the event of a fire, you seal the compartment. You isolate the burning section to save the ship. But there are men inside. This is the brutal calculus of submarine warfare. To save the ship, you have to kill your friends. If you leave the hatch open to let them escape, the fire spreads and everyone dies. If you close the hatch, the men inside burn or suffocate, but the ship might survive. The men in the second compartment hesitate, but the smoke is already blinding them. Carbon monoxide is flooding the air. In the control room, the third compartment, Captain Stepanov takes charge. He orders the boat to surface. Emergency blow, all tanks. The high-pressure air roars into the ballast tanks. The K-3 angles up, rocketing toward the surface. But in the forward compartments, the tragedy is playing out in intimate, horrifying detail. The fire breaches the bulkhead between the first and second compartments. The hydraulic fluid, still under pressure, is feeding the flames like a flamethrower. The second compartment becomes an oven. The men in the second compartment try to fight it. They grab extinguishers. They pull on their IDI breathing masks. But the smoke is too thick. It is filled with carbon monoxide, which kills silently and quickly. Some of the sailors in the second compartment realize they are trapped. The hatch to the control room is sealed. The hatch to the torpedo room is a wall of fire. There is a moment of decision that defines the heroism of the K-3 crew. Realizing they cannot escape, and realizing that if the fire spreads to the control room, the ship is lost. Some of the men stop trying to flee. Instead, they secure their stations. They close valves. They shut down electrical panels. They use their bodies to block the leaks. One sailor, seeing the fire rushing toward the hatch to the third compartment, physically throws himself against the door to dog it down from the inside. He locks himself in with the fire to protect the command center. He chooses to burn so the ship can live. The submarine breaches the surface. It rolls in the swell. Captain Stepanov throws open the bridge hatch. Smoke billows out of the forward vents like a chimney. Ventilate, get the smoke out. But the fire has consumed the oxygen in the forward compartments. And now, with the hatch open, fresh air rushes in. This is the backdraft effect. The fire, starved of oxygen, suddenly gets a massive lungful of fresh air. It roars back to life with renewed violence. The men in the control room are fighting to keep the reactor online. If the reactor scrams and the diesels fail, the ship will lose power. Without power, they cannot run the pumps. Without pumps, they cannot fight the fire. The engineers back in the reactor compartment, the fifth compartment, are watching their gauges. They know there's a fire forward. They can smell the smoke coming through the ventilation. But they cannot leave their posts. They stand next to the nuclear pile, keeping the coolant flowing, keeping the lights on. They are trusting their shipmates to win the battle in the bow. In the forward compartments, the battle is lost. The fire burns itself out only after it has consumed everything flammable. The torpedoes, miraculously, do not detonate. The heat shielding holds just long enough, or perhaps the lack of oxygen snuffed the fire around the warheads before they reached critical temperature. It is a matter of luck as much as engineering. When the smoke finally clears enough for rescue teams to enter the forward compartments, the scene is apocalyptic. The paint is gone. The metal is black. The bodies of the crew are found at their stations or piled near the hatches where they tried to escape. 39 men are dead, more than a third of the crew. They died from burns, they died from carbon monoxide, they died from the toxic fumes of burning hydraulic fluid. But the ship is floating, the reactor is running, the missiles are safe. The survivors gather on the deck and in the aft compartments. They are in shock. Their faces are blackened with soot. They have lost their friends, their bunkmates, their brothers. Captain Stepanov has to make a decision. The K-3 is crippled. The forward compartments are a tomb. The radio is working. He sends a coded message to the Northern Fleet headquarters. Fire on board, 39 casualties, reactor secure, requesting assistance. The response from Moscow is not one of immediate comfort, it is one of panic. A nuclear submarine on fire in international waters? Near NATO territory? The priority shifts instantly from rescue to containment. Not containment of the fire, that is out, but containment of the information. Maintain radio silence. Do not accept assistance from foreign vessels. Return to base immediately. The K-3 turns east. It limps home on the surface, a smoking, scarred ghost. The bodies of the 39 men remain in the forward compartments. There is nowhere else to put them. The survivors have to live and work next to the sealed bulkheads, knowing that on the other side lie the charred remains of their friends. This journey home is a funeral procession of one. The K-3, the pride of the Soviet Union, the conqueror of the North Pole, is now a hearse. The fire of 1967 was a tragedy born of fatigue. It was the result of pushing a machine and a crew beyond their limits. The gasket failed because it was old. The fire spread because the design was cramped. The men died because the system prioritized the survival of the hardware over the survival of the human software. But in the cold logic of the Cold War, the mission was a success. The ship did not sink. The nuclear weapons did not detonate. The Americans did not capture the technology. The secrets were safe. The cost was just 39 letters to 39 mothers telling them their sons died, fulfilling their internationalist duty. A vague, hollow phrase that explained nothing. As the K-3 approaches the Soviet coast, the cover-up begins. The hero ship cannot be seen to be flawed. The narrative of Soviet technological superiority must be maintained. The fire will be classified. The deaths will be hidden. The K-3 will be scrubbed clean, repaired, and sent back out. But the ghosts of the first compartment will never leave. They are fused to the steel of the hull. They are the silent witnesses to the price of parity. The K-3 limps back into the Kolu Bay under a gray, indifferent sky. It does not return to the fanfare that greeted it after the North Pole mission. There are no newsreel cameras. There are no bands playing on the pier. The submarine is directed to a secluded berth at the Zapadnya Litsa base, far away from prying eyes. When the gangway is lowered, the survivors stumble off. They are exhausted, their faces still ingrained with soot that soap cannot reach, their lungs burning from the toxic smoke. They are greeted not by doctors or grief counselors, but by KGB officers and a special commission from Moscow. The bodies of the 39 dead are removed from the forward compartments at night, under the cover of darkness. They are placed in sealed zinc coffins. The families are not allowed to view them. The official reason is disfigurement, but the real reason is secrecy. The state does not want anyone asking why their sons are burned or why they smell of hydraulic fluid and ozone. The immediate aftermath of the fire is defined by a suffocating silence. The survivors are isolated in a barracks. They are debriefed for hours. They are told what to say and, more importantly, what not to say. They are forced to sign non-disclosure agreements that carry the threat of imprisonment for treason. It was an accident, they are told, a technical malfunction, but the enemy is watching. Loose talk costs lives. The Cold War logic takes over. In the eyes of the Kremlin, the fire on the K-3 is not a tragedy. It is an intelligence vulnerability. If the West learns that Soviet nuclear submarines are prone to catastrophic hydraulic fires, it reveals a weakness. It reveals that the Soviet underwater fleet is a paper tiger. Dangerous, yes, but brittle. So the event is erased. The logbooks are classified top secret. The letters sent to the families are masterpieces of ambiguity. Died while performing combat duties. It could mean anything. It could mean a training accident, a storm, or a fall down a ladder. It denies the families the specific dignity of knowing how their loved ones died. It turns a heroic sacrifice into a bureaucratic statistic. But erasing the event is not enough. The system needs a culprit. In the Soviet Union, there is no such thing as a pure accident. Accidents imply a lack of control, and the Communist Party controls everything. Therefore, an accident must have a cause, and that cause must be human error. Admitting that the machine itself was flawed, that the gaskets were inferior, that the hydraulic system was poorly designed, that the layout of the compartments was a death trap, would be an indictment of Soviet engineering and, by extension, the Soviet state. It is much easier to blame a dead man. The Commission of Inquiry focuses on the sailor who was in the first compartment when the fire started. They construct a narrative of negligence. He was smoking, they suggest. He used an unauthorized lighter. He flipped the wrong switch. They sift through the charred wreckage of the torpedo room, looking for evidence to support this theory. They find a lighter in the pocket of a dead sailor's uniform. It becomes Exhibit A. Never mind that almost every sailor on the boat smoked. Never mind that the lighter could have been there for weeks. In the report, it becomes the smoking gun. The narrative shifts from heroic struggle to criminal negligence. The dead men cannot defend themselves. They cannot explain that the hydraulic mist was already in the air before the spark happened. They cannot explain that the gasket failed on its own. This verdict serves two purposes. First, it exonerates the designers. The design bureau is protected. The admirals who pushed the K-3 into service without proper overhauls are protected. The factory managers who supplied the gaskets are protected. Second, it serves as a grim warning to the rest of the fleet. See, the political officers say, carelessness kills. Follow the regulations. The survivors are outraged. They know the truth. They know their shipmates were not careless. They know they were fighting a fire that was inevitable in a ship pushed beyond its limits. Captain Stepanov tries to defend his crew. He argues with the commission. He points out the maintenance logs, the reports of leaks, the requests for repairs that were ignored. But a captain's word is weak against the weight of the state. Stepanov is not court-martialed. That would draw too much attention, but his career is effectively sidelined. He is marked as a man who lost control of his ship. The injustice of this blame cuts deeper than the fire itself. The men of the K-3 gave everything. They saved the ship. They prevented a nuclear explosion. They locked themselves in burning compartments to protect the command center, and in return, the state spits on their graves. The crew becomes expendable. This is the dark heart of the Soviet military machine. The hardware, the submarine, the reactor, the missiles, is precious. It is the tangible proof of superpower status. The people are replaceable. Conscripts are cheap. There are always more 18-year-olds from the collective farms ready to serve. But a nuclear submarine takes years to build. So the K-3 is repaired. The charred metal is cut out. New cables are run. The smell of smoke is scrubbed away with harsh chemicals, though veterans say it never truly left the steel. The ship is repainted, and then it is sent back to sea. It is a zombie ship now. The spirit of the original crew, the pioneers of the North Pole, is broken. The new crew comes aboard with a heavy heart. They know the rumors. They whisper about the unlucky boat. They check the hydraulic seals obsessively. The K-3 continues to serve for another 20 years. It patrols the Atlantic. It tracks American boomers. It plays its part in the dance of deterrence, but it is never the same. It is a haunted vessel, carrying the weight of the lie in its hull. The convenient guilt of the dead sailors protects the institution, but it rots the soul of the Navy. It creates a culture of cynicism. Sailors learn that the system will not protect them. They learn to hide problems rather than report them, because reporting a problem might get you blamed for it. This culture of silence and cover-up contributes to future disasters, the Komsomolites, the Kursk. The lesson of the K-3 is not learned, it is buried. The families of the 39 men are left in a limbo of grief. They gather on the anniversary of the fire, quietly, in private apartments. They toast to the memory of their sons, but they cannot speak openly. They cannot build a monument. There is no plaque in the town square. For decades, the fire on the K-3 remains a rumor. In the West, intelligence agencies catch wind of it. Intercepted radio traffic, a sudden disappearance of a pennant number from the order of battle, but they don't know the details. They assume it was a reactor accident. The truth of the hydraulic fire remains locked in the KGB archives. It is only later, much later, that the silence begins to crack. As the Soviet Union begins to crumble in the late 1980s, the grip of the censor loosens. The survivors, now old men, start to talk. They write letters to newspapers. They demand justice for their dead friends. They demand that the criminal negligence verdict be overturned. They demand that the men be recognized as heroes who saved the ship, not idiots who burned it. It is a long, slow fight. The bureaucracy resists. Admitting a mistake from 1967 implies admitting that the system was flawed. But the K-3 itself is changing. By the late 1980s, it is finally retired. It is too old, too radioactive, too dangerous to sail. It is tied up at a pier in Gremika, the graveyard of the Northern Fleet. It sits there, rusting, listing slightly in the cold water. The reactor is shut down. The lights are off. It becomes a ghost ship in the truest sense. The wind whistles through the open bridge hatch. The snow piles up on the casing. It looks like a discarded toy of a giant. But even as it rusts, the K-3 remains a witness. It holds the physical evidence of the fire, the scorch marks behind the new paint, the warped bulkheads. The ship itself knows the truth, even if the history books lie. The survival of the K-3 after the fire was a miracle of damage control. The silence that followed was a masterpiece of state control. The two are inextricably linked. You cannot have the Cold War without the secrets. The power of the weapon depends on the illusion of invulnerability. But illusions are fragile. Eventually, the truth acts like water. It finds a crack. It weeps through the seals. And just as the hydraulic fluid found a spark, the truth finds a voice. The convenient guilty are finally exonerated, not by a court, but by time. The archives open, the reports are read, and we see the K-3 fire not as a crime, but as a tragedy of ambition. We see men trying to operate a machine that was built too fast, pushed too hard, and cared for too little. We see the cost of the Nautilus shock. The panic of 1955 led directly to the fire of 1967. The impossible deadlines led to the faulty gaskets. The political pressure led to the cover-up. It is a straight line of cause and effect, drawn in blood on the deck plates of the Leninsky Komsomol. The Soviet Union collapses in 1991. The empire that built the K-3, that sent it to the North Pole, and that buried the truth of the fire, simply ceases to exist. In the chaos that follows, the rigid structures of secrecy begin to rust away, much like the hulls of the submarines abandoned in the Arctic bays. For the survivors of the K-3 fire, this new era brings a glimmer of hope. For decades, they have lived with the stigma of the official report. They have carried the weight of being the crew that failed. Now, with the KGB gone and the archives opening, they see a chance to rewrite the ending of their story. But justice moves slower than history. The archives of the Soviet Navy are a labyrinth of paper. Millions of documents, mission logs, technical reports, disciplinary records are stacked in damp basements in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Finding the specific file on the 1967 fire is not easy. And even if you find it, reading it requires permission. The Russian Federation inherits the secrets of the USSR, and the reflex to hide mistakes is still strong in the military bureaucracy. It takes years of lobbying. The veterans form an association. They write to admirals. They write to the president. They find allies among naval historians and journalists who are hungry to uncover the blank spots of the Cold War. Finally, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the documents are declassified. The report on the 1967 fire is chilling in its banality. It is typed on yellowing paper stamped top secret in red ink. As the historians and veterans parse the technical language, the truth begins to emerge, and it vindicates the dead. The investigation reveals that the hydraulic gasket which failed was not damaged by the crew. It was a manufacturing defect. The copper washer used in the seal was of uneven thickness. Under the immense pressure of the hydraulic system and subjected to the constant vibration of the ship, it simply disintegrated. Furthermore, the report acknowledges, buried in the appendices, that the design of the K-3 contributed to the disaster. The lack of fire suppression systems in the forward compartment was a known flaw. The ventilation system, which spread the smoke so quickly, was poorly laid out. The emergency breathing masks, IDIs, were difficult to put on in the dark and had a high failure rate. The most damning revelation concerns the lighter. The investigation admits in a single sentence that while a lighter was found, there was no evidence it was the ignition source. The hydraulic mist would have ignited from any spark, a light switch, a relay clicking, even static electricity from a uniform. The smoking sailor theory was a fabrication, a convenient narrative constructed to close the case quickly. The archives speak, but they speak too late for the mothers and fathers of the 39 men. Most of the parents are dead. They went to their graves believing their sons were careless, or at best, victims of an unexplainable accident. They never knew that their sons were victims of a defective copper washer and a rush to production. However, for the surviving crew members, the revelation is profound. It lifts the burden of guilt. They were not negligent. They were placed in a machine that was destined to fail, and when it did, they behaved with extraordinary courage. The narrative shifts. The men who died are no longer accidents. They are saviors. The sailor who dogged the hatch from the inside, trapping himself in the fire to save the control room, is recognized as a hero. The engineers who kept the reactor stable while choking on smoke are recognized as professionals of the highest order. In 2014, nearly 50 years after the fire, the crew of the K-3 is finally awarded the Order of Courage by the Russian government. It is a posthumous award for the dead and a long overdue validation for the living. But the delay carries a moral weight. Why did it take 50 years? The answer lies in the nature of institutions. An institution, whether it is the Soviet Navy, the U.S. Navy, or a corporation, has a primary instinct: self-preservation. To admit a mistake is to show weakness. To admit that the K-3 was flawed would have been to admit that the catch-up and overtake strategy was flawed. It would have called into question the entire submarine program. So, the institution protected itself by sacrificing the reputation of its sailors. It is a story as old as warfare. The soldiers on the front line pay the price for the decisions made in the capital. The archives also reveal the close calls that the public never knew about. The K-3 didn't just have one fire, it had radiation leaks in 1962. It had a reactor incident in 1965. The fire of 1967 was just the one they couldn't hide because of the body count. The ship was a constant flirtation with disaster. Reading the maintenance logs of the K-3 is like reading a horror story written in the language of engineering. Kraken steam generator number 2. High radiation levels in compartment 5. Coolant pump vibration excessive. And next to each entry, a signature from an officer authorizing the ship to sail anyway. Operational necessity. That was the phrase that justified everything. The Cold War demanded presence. The K-3 had to be out there, somewhere in the Atlantic, forcing the Americans to watch their backs. If it was leaking, so be it. The archives also shed light on the psychological toll. We find medical reports of sailors discharged for nervous exhaustion. We find letters from captains begging for spare parts that never arrive. We see a picture of a navy that was stretching itself to the breaking point, trying to match a wealthier adversary through sheer grit and sacrifice. This contextualizes the heroism. It is one thing to be brave in a perfect machine. It is another thing entirely to be brave in a machine you know is broken. The crew of the K-3 knew the risks. They saw the leaks, they felt the vibrations, and they sailed anyway. Why? Patriotism, certainly. The indoctrination of the Soviet era was powerful. They believed they were defending the motherland from imperialist aggression. But there was also a professional pride. They were submariners. They were an elite tribe. They didn't sail for the party. They sailed for each other. They sailed because if they didn't, someone else would have to. The archival revelations transformed the K-3 from a symbol of Soviet power into a symbol of Soviet sacrifice. It becomes a tragic object. We look at the photos of the launch, the champagne smashing, the smiling faces, and now we see the ghost standing behind them. We see the trajectory that leads inevitably to the fire. The delay in justice also speaks to the trauma of the post-Soviet transition. For a decade, Russia wanted to forget the Soviet past. It wanted to forget the Cold War. The K-3 was an embarrassing relic of a failed empire. It was only when Russia began to rebuild its identity, looking for heroes in its history, that the K-3 could be redeemed. It needed to become a Russian story, not just a Soviet one. But the rehabilitation of the K-3 comes with a danger. There is a risk of romanticizing the suffering. We must be careful not to turn the negligence into a noble virtue. The men died because of bad engineering and bad management. That is not noble, it is criminal. Their reaction was noble, but the cause was preventable. The archives are now open, but they are not empty. There are still redacted lines, there are still missing pages. The full story of the K-3 likely contains details we will never know, conversations that were never written down, orders given over secure phones. But we know enough. We know that the last giant of the pioneer era was built on a foundation of sand. We know that the race to the North Pole was a race against the ship's own endurance. And we know that when the fire came, it burned away the propaganda and left only the raw, human reality of men trying to survive in a steel box. As we move toward the conclusion of the story, the K-3 itself enters its final act. It is no longer a warship. It has survived the scrapper's torch. It has survived the neglect of the 1990s. It is about to undergo a transformation that is almost as miraculous as its creation. But before we see the museum, we must acknowledge the cost of the ticket. The price of admission to the nuclear club was 39 lives in the Norwegian Sea, and thousands more shortened by radiation. The archives have finally given us the receipt. The final act of the K-3 Leninsky Komsomol is perhaps the most unlikely chapter in its long, troubled history. After the fire, after the cover-up, and after decades of neglect, the submarine seemed destined for the scrapyard. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the graveyards of the Russian Navy were full of nuclear submarines. The Victors, the Charlies, the Alfus, rotting at the pier, their reactors removed, their hulls cut up for razor blades. The K-3 was sitting in Gremika, a desolate base on the Kolu Peninsula, waiting for the torch. It was a rusted, hollow shell. The reactor compartment had been cut out due to its high contamination and replaced with a dummy section to keep the ship floating. It looked less like a historic monument and more like industrial waste. But the K-3 refused to die. A coalition of veterans, historians, and engineers began a campaign to save the ship. They argued that the K-3 was not just a piece of metal, it was the Aurora of the nuclear age. The cruiser Aurora is the symbol of the Bolshevik Revolution in St. Petersburg. They argued that destroying the first Soviet nuclear submarine would be an act of cultural vandalism. It was a hard sell. Russia in the 2000s had many problems, and preserving a radioactive, fire-damaged submarine was not a priority. But slowly, the tide turned. The historical significance of the vessel, the North Pole mission, the technological breakthrough, began to outweigh the shame of the accident. In a massive engineering operation, the K-3 was moved. It was towed from the remote base to a shipyard. It was placed in a floating dry dock, and then it began a journey that mirrored its life. Difficult, expensive, and fraught with technical challenges. The decision was made to turn the K-3 into a museum ship. But not just a ship floating at a pier, it would be moved inland. It would be transported to Kronstadt, the historic naval fortress near St. Petersburg. The restoration was painstaking. The hull was sandblasted, removing 50 years of marine growth and rust. The interior, gutted by time and the fire, was reconstructed. The control room was restored to its 1960s appearance. The analog dials, the heavy switches, the periscope. The compartments where the men died were cleaned and sanctified. In 2022, the K-3 was loaded onto a massive barge and transported through the canals and rivers of Russia. It was a surreal sight, a 100-meter black submarine gliding past forests and villages, a leviathan out of water. Finally, it arrived in Kronstadt. It was lifted out of the water and placed inside a dedicated building, the Museum of Naval Glory. Today, you can walk through the K-3. You can touch the cold steel of the hull. You can stand in the control room where Captain Jiltsov ordered the dive under the ice. You can walk through the first and second compartments where the fire raged. But the K-3 is no longer a weapon, it is a witness. It stands as a silent testimony to the era of the Cold War. When you walk through its corridors, you are not just walking through a ship. You are walking through the mindset of the mid-20th century. You can feel the claustrophobia, you can feel the urgency. The tight spaces scream of the compromise between human comfort and machine performance. The museum tells the story of the technology, the reactor, the turbines, the torpedoes. But if you listen closely, the ship tells a different story. It tells the story of the men. It is a monument to the 39 sailors who died in 1967. Their names are finally listed, their photos are on the wall. They are no longer anonymous casualties of a technical malfunction. They are the crew. The K-3 also serves as a warning. It is a physical reminder of what happens when fear drives engineering. It is a monument to the catch-up and overtake philosophy. It shows us what can be achieved with unlimited resources and unlimited disregard for safety. It is impressive, yes, but it is also terrifying. In the final analysis, what did the K-3 achieve? Did it win the Cold War? No. The Soviet Union lost. The ideology that built the K-3 collapsed. The empire that sent it to the North Pole dissolved. But the K-3 did something else. It helped ensure that the Cold War stayed cold. By proving that the Soviet Union could match the United States underwater, the K-3 restored the balance of terror. It proved that a first strike by the West would not go unanswered. It helped create the stalemate of mutually assured destruction. And in that terrifying, precarious stalemate, the world avoided World War III. The K-3 was a weapon of mass destruction that thankfully never fired a shot in anger. Its victory was not in sinking enemy ships, but in existing. It was a piece on the chessboard that forced the other side to pause. However, the cost of that pause was high. It was paid by the crew. As we stand at the end of this story, looking back at the gray hull of the Leninsky Komsomol, we are left with a complex emotion. It is not simple pride. It is not simple horror. It is a mixture of awe and sadness. We are in awe of the intellect that could conceive of such a machine. We are in awe of the courage of the men who sailed it into the unknown. But we are saddened by the system that treated them as expendable. The story of the K-3 is the story of the 20th century distilled into a single object. It has everything: the atom, the Arctic, the secrets, the lies, the heroism, and the tragedy. The ocean has returned to silence. The sonar pings of the Cold War have faded, mostly. The ice at the North Pole is thinning, not from submarines, but from climate change. The world has moved on to new fears: cyber warfare, drones, AI. But the K-3 remains. It sits in its glass hall in Kronstadt, safe from the salt and the waves. The reactor is gone, the fire is out, the ghosts are at rest. It is the last giant of the pioneer era. It has finished its patrol. History is often written by the victors, and in the case of the Cold War, the narrative is dominated by the West. We know the story of the Nautilus, we know the story of Apollo, we know the triumphs of democracy and capitalism. The story of the K-3 offers a necessary counter-perspective. It shows us the view from the other side. It shows us a nation that was terrified, encircled, and desperate to survive. It shows us that the evil empire was populated by brilliant engineers and brave sailors who loved their country just as much as their American counterparts. It reminds us that technology is never neutral. A machine carries the values of the society that built it. The Nautilus carried the values of stability and safety. The K-3 carried the values of speed and sacrifice. When we look at the K-3, we are looking in a mirror. We see the extremes of human capability. We see our ability to master the fundamental forces of the universe, to split the atom and go to the pole, and we see our ability to delude ourselves, to ignore the warnings, to hide the truth, to rationalize the death of the innocent. The K-3 did not change the laws of physics. It just proved that you can cheat them for a while if you're willing to pay the price. And that is the final lesson of the Leninsky Komsomol. Progress is never free. The future is bought with the currency of the present. The K-3 bought the Soviet Union a ticket to the nuclear table. The price was a copper washer, a spark, and 39 lives. Was it worth it? The ship cannot answer. It can only stand there, mute and massive, and let us decide for ourselves.